So what I'll tell you about today is firstly who I am. I'm Dan, and I work for Google in South Africa. Yeah, we do have an office in South Africa. What I do there is mostly AdSense, but they let me out of my cage long enough to do stuff like this, which I'm really grateful for. So I'm going to talk today about a couple of things, three things really. Google APIs, a little bit of Ruby on Rails, and Google Compute Engine. So I always like to start off by getting a feeling for the room. So hands up if you've used Ruby on Rails before. Well, so that means that 99% of you know 50% more than, no, probably 99% more than I do. And I'm not as smart as the dude that presented before me, so I won't go into abstractions about that and the meaning of that. So please bear with me, is what I'm saying. Now, Google APIs, who's used one? Okay, so it's almost as many as Ruby on Rails, but you know, at least it's not a foreign concept. Google Compute Engine. All right, at least now I have an advantage over some of you. So this is Google APIs for Ruby. I bet you didn't know they existed. On Ruby on Rails, on Google Compute Engine, or a symphony in 6 parts. I'm not very good at music, so you'll have to forgive my symphony. So a little bit of where are we in the universe of discourse? We are in the Google Cloud Platform, which consists of a number of products which help you do stuff in the cloud. So if you've heard of the concepts of platform as a service or infrastructure as a service, App Engine is platform as a service, so you deploy apps. It's what you would kind of call an app container or a web application container. Compute Engine is virtual machines in the cloud. And the other stuff, cloud storage is a file system in the cloud. Cloud SQL is your MySQL databases in the cloud. Data store is a NoSQL database in the cloud. And BigQuery is like the red-headed stepchild because it's just lots of data and queries on lots of data. So for me, it feels a bit incongruent, but anyway, it's there. So, you know, with this stack of products, you can really get a lot out of the cloud, and that's a good thing. So the Google API for Ruby. So I asked about Google APIs, and you can't claim you don't know about them now. So there are a bunch of APIs, like Calendar API, Drive API, Google Plus, and so on. And it turns out that over 50 of them have been ported to Ruby, so that you can use these APIs from your Ruby applications. Yeah, that's quite a lot. So in this talk, I'll talk about Compute Engine, and I chose one of the APIs at random, and I'll show you how to do it. I must just mention that the Google API for Ruby is in alpha. It's like not really supported by any real humans, just people who like Ruby. But I had to just check that you were still awake. I mean, I feel a little fuzzy after all of the abstraction of earlier. Okay, so a little bit of salesy stuff. Why should you use the Google Cloud Platform? You know, a couple things that I like. So it's powered by Google's global network, which is pretty good. Load balancing is kind of built in, and compliance and security. Your data is encrypted at rest, which I think is pretty cool, and some other nice companies use it, like the guys who make Angry Birds. So I'll give you something that's hopefully a real-world example, something that you can relate to, and it's sort of I've deployed it. So you could, if you wanted to play around with it and see what I'm talking about. But you've all used short URLs. There is one called goo.gl, which is if you use Google's URL shortener API, that's what you get. And so I built something in Ruby on Rails, on Compute Engine, which would allow you to create new short links and to list your short links. So that's what the example is. And this is how you go about it. Well, this is how I went about it. You guys probably know much better ways of doing it, but this is what I did. So the first 3 parts of this are really setting up the cloud part. So you need to set up your cloud project, which we'll look at. You need to create a new virtual machine. You need to install some SDK libraries on your development environment. And then you have to obviously install and set up Ruby on Rails, which I found is trivial. I'm really happy about that. And then I think the hardest part of this all was writing the OAuth 2 code, because that's sometimes a little tricky. But there's hope, because I have some good news for you. So those are the 6 things we'll cover now. And I remember I said it was a symphony, and so we start with the drums, which is kind of like the base of it. So you go to cloud.google.com, you create a new project, there's the big whomping red button that says create project. I did a screenshot in case you missed it. And then, if you've worked with the Google APIs before, you'll be familiar with the concept of enabling the API for your use. So you have enabled it, and you will get a key which says this is me using this thing. If you use the map API, you'll probably be used to that. So you need to enable the URL shortener API. So you have a project. Inside that project, the URL shortener API is enabled. Then you have to create a new OAuth web application client ID. So this is now, I'm not going to go into OAuth because, to be truthful, I think it was Einstein who said, if you can't explain a thing properly, you probably don't know it. And if I try and explain it, you'll probably guess I don't know it that well. So, right, basically, you have to create an OAuth web application client ID so that you're identifying yourself as something that users give access to. Right. And then, of course, you have to enable, for your project, Compute Engine. Now, this is just really clicking buttons. When you enable Cloud Compute, because Compute Engine isn't a free product, you have to enable billing, which means giving you credit card details. So we've got the drums. Okay, we've got the project created now. We have a place to go to call home, and we're not homeless anymore. And we now put the violin, because it's sweet strings, and that's pretty good. You can't see my screenshot over there, but I'll explain it. So you're back in your console, your cloud.google.com/console. You've created your project, so select it. And there's a big button that says create under the Compute Engine menu, there's a big button that says create new instance. You've really just got to give it a name. You've got to choose a zone where you want it to reside, and I think the zones are US and Europe, US Central and Europe West, if I recall correctly. The machine type, so there's a range of machine types that you can use, and this is basically the combination of the amount of RAM and virtual CPUs that you get. So I chose the smallest one, which has 1 CPU and just over ½ a gig of RAM, which, by the way, you can't install Passenger on. I tried, and it told me no, so I learned something. And then you choose the OS image. So out of the box, by default, Debian and CentOS are supported. The nice thing is that once you go along and you have done some work on your OS images, you can then save it as a custom image and reuse that across different virtual machines. So if you have a particular configuration that you like to use on instances, then you can create custom images for that. And then, as part of this exercise, a static IP address was required, and the only reason it was required was because of OAuth, because OAuth won't let me use just an IP address for the redirect URI, so I had to create a static IP address and point my DNS to that. So you can get, so static IP addresses cost you something, but ephemeral IP addresses don't. They're kind of part of the package. So if you don't really need a static IP address, you don't need to create it. And you wait 30 seconds or so, and then your VM is ready. So because I'm using Ruby on Rails and I am too lazy to figure out how to change the default port that it runs on, I had to open up a TCP thing in my firewall to allow TCP traffic on port 3000, which is just a couple clicks away. And the last thing I need to do to configure my Compute Engine VM is where it lists all my VMs, there's a button that just says SSH. And what you really have to do is get a command. So you click the button, it copies something into your into your clipboard, and that's it. Don't worry about what you do with it. It'll become clear right now. So we have our drums, we have our violins, and now we have the flute. This is classical music, and it's a symphony, right? So this is the part where you configure your environment as opposed to what's in the cloud. And all you really need to do is install the Cloud SDK. And what that really gives you is a bunch of utilities. The most useful of one, which I used, was called something called GCUtil for Google Cloud Util. And GCUtil lets you do stuff like SSH into your virtual machines or copy files between cloud storage and stuff. So it's necessary to have what's required. So the SSH command that we got from before, we just use it. It's a GCUtil command, so you need the Cloud SDK for it. And the first time you log in, there'll be some key exchange happening. But after that, you just use the same command. You can make an alias if you feel like it. And that's it. So now you have a project, you have a VM, and you have your environment set up. You're ready to go. So, of course, it feels like today no real pop songs are around without a banjo, so I said it was a symphony, but I feel like we need a banjo. And so if you can see these commands, it's just a list of commands. I think there are 7 of them. Not very complicated. And this is really just installing Ruby and what Ruby requires, installing Rails, installing the Ruby Racer. I don't know why you need a JavaScript engine for Ruby, but let's just not go there. And something else called Signet Rails, which I'll talk about now. But that's what helps us with OAuth, and thanks to Signet, OAuth is a lot more easy. And then, of course, the last thing, I just made a new Rails application called Shortlinks. So now, don't try this at home. I'm sure there are things that I missed out, but the idea is that it's pretty simple. So we've got our drums playing, our violins playing, our flutes playing, and the banjo. So it's a pretty messed up cacophony. So I've got 2 banjos. That's how much I love banjos, right? And so this is what I needed to do to implement OAuth 2. You can see it's the longest slide because it was the most complicated thing to do. So there's a gem that helps a lot with this. Happens to be written by, I think, the same people that write the gem for the Google APIs. Because they probably went through this and said, yo, this is really hard, guys. We should do something about this. So Signet came about, and that makes my life easier. So we've installed the gem for Signet Rails. Now we have to do some plumbing, right? So we need a sessions controller. And the sessions controller is really just create a session, destroy a session. And in OAuth terms, it means like, do I have an access token? Do I need one? Do some magic behind the scenes. But luckily, Signet takes care of that. I need models for the user, and they are OAuth 2 credentials, so that if you log back in, they can identify you by some magic. You need routes for login and logout, so this kind of goes hand in hand with the sessions controller, which is logging in is doing all the session setup, logging out to session teardown. And there's a bit of like kind of boilerplate code for Signet Rails. And what you need there is an initializer, and the initializer basically, you take your OAuth 2 client ID and client secret, and you tell it about it. And that's it. And then, of course, back in your cloud project, you have to update your OAuth redirect URI. And this is why I needed a static address, because I pointed whatever it was to the IP address so that I could use that in my OAuth 2 callback. And then, some useful helper methods to identify the current user, to check if the user is logged in, and so on. Okay, so, in for a penny, in for a pound, we've got a banjo, so now we have a ukulele. And so there are really 3 steps to this. This is the last part of the symphony. We've got a project, we've got a VM, we've got Ruby on Rails. We've figured out that Signet can help us. Now let's put it all together so that we can invoke the Google API client. So this is really the first line where you see auth equals Signet Rails factory, blah, blah, blah. That is the only line, apart from the Signet initializer, that you need to get hold of the OAuth 2 stuff. So that's really useful. What could have been a number of lines is now reduced to just one. So here I am creating a new API client. I'm telling it the authorization details. I'm saying which service I want. So in this case, the services are all the APIs that you can have. So you can have analytics, you can have AdSense, you can have other things. And so this is, for all of my calls that I wish to do, this is kind of what I need to do. I need to get a client. I need to tell the client what I'm doing. And that headers line just says that I'm transmitting information using JSON. So this is how you invoke the Google API. And like someone earlier spoke about long methods with lots of lines of code. But that's really just one line of code. I just formatted it because I love you guys and it's easy to read. So all I'm saying is execute a particular API method. In this case, list all of the short URLs that I have created. I being the user that is logged in at the moment, authorized by my tokens from OAuth 2 and Signet. Because it's just a simple list, it's going to be a GET request at the background. I don't have to give it any parameters, and the headers are, I'm just saying, give it back to me in JSON. So that's pretty simple, right? If I want to do a post or put or whatever it is, something that I need to send data along with my request that doesn't go on the request or the query string, I have to create an instance, I suppose, of the schema for the request for that particular operation. So in this case, the operation I want to invoke is a URL insert. In other words, I want to create a short URL from a long URL. So I've instantiated I've made an instance of the request schema, and I've told it that this is the long URL that I want. And the only difference between the post and the get is this. So before I had parameters. I don't need parameters if I'm doing a post. I could have them if I wanted, but I don't need them. And instead, I'm putting the data in the body, as you do with a post. So the body object is really just a hash sort of thing that comes from my schema. Okay, so we've had some drums, we've got a VM, we've had some violins, some flute, and then the banjo, ukulele. I've got a good memory, but I'm getting old. So that's what we covered. We've set up a project, which, it's really quick and easy. Created a new compute engine virtual machine, which again, really easy. Setting up the environment for Google Cloud, which is the SDK. Setting up Ruby on Rails, which is, like I say, trivial. Writing OAuth 2 code and writing Google API code. So one of the questions that I always come up with is, yeah, it's great. I have this virtual machine in the cloud, fantastic. But how much does it cost, right? Because App Engine is cool. I don't know if you've used App Engine before, but App Engine is cool because it's got a free quota. And that means, because I'm a cheap bastard, it means that I can do stuff for free. And I'm not that popular, so I can get a lot of mileage out of my free quota for App Engine. Not so with Compute Engine, as it turns out. So the pricing for Compute Engine is at that URL, but it's basically charged by your usage of things like processors, networking, and resources such as static IPs. So I thought, it'd be really cool to figure out how much something costs. And the something in this case was setting up Ruby, the Google API for Ruby on Rails on Compute Engine. And it cost, not me, it cost Google less than $3, which, well, considering, and I was doing it really stupidly, and that's just because I wanted to rack up as much as I could. I had all of the coding that I did with all the Signet and stuff was in a terminal over SSH. So I didn't write the stuff on my local environment and then copy it up like any sane person would. So I was probably using more ingress and egress bandwidth than I needed to, is my point. But that's okay, because I like to give you a worst case scenario, and I think $3 is it's not that much. And that's it. I think I pulled us back on track a little bit. And if you want to see it, okay, it's not much. You kind of know what a web app looks like, but I've deployed my sample at shortlinks.danielacton.com:3000. I would like to know how much you can make me pay before I have to take it down, because I get a nasty email from someone because I'm spending too much money. But some other useful URLs. So if you go to developers.google.com, it's like a wealth of information. I wish I had that when I was a kid. And you know, if you go to those URLs, you'll find information about Ruby. And this one here is a very useful resource for the Signet Rails gem, and how to use it and how to set it up. So that helped me a lot because it was complicated. And that's it. I'm done. If you happen to have questions, you can catch me outside.
No come electro por la vida.